Welcome back, class, to the rest of Chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Judge Peacock from Ithaca City Court to start this coverage of Chapter 4 and our U.S. Constitution, the foundation or the bedrock of all U.S. law, our government, the legal system. It all comes back to this. So now I think is a good time, and the book does too in Chapter 4. I'm going to start with the preamble, which is sort of an introduction to our founding document here. And it states, we the people. You may be familiar with the first three words, we the people. So the power of our government comes from us. So it's back to that idea of the social contract. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So there's not law in the preamble. We're going to go into the articles and the amendments after that. However, that those goals stated in the introduction match what the authors of the Constitution, the framers, our forefathers, had in mind when forming the government. So if you think of the social contract theory again, this is an important part of the contract which talks about what we're considering when we're giving our government the power over us to create law. And there's conditions that are created in there. There's some values that we have that are fundamental to the foundation of our government and the US legal system. So, those include a lot of the goals we talked about in Chapter 1 for a successful government, for a successful legal system. Tranquility. So, as a business person, we come back to that goal of having tranquility, stability, a business environment where a good business person can do business and have some, predictability over variables. Defense, general welfare, and liberty, and that's a heavy, somewhat unique at the time value that, I believe the Constitution as an experiment, as a social contract, is succeeding. And I think no knowledgeable business person or even any citizen can ignore the basic concepts here. And the Constitution is sort of the, I keep coming back to that foundation, the bedrock of US law. It's also, you can think of it maybe as the DNA of our country, of our nation, something that can't really be easily changed. There's things that happen in biology that can change with DNA, but the Constitution, I think, is comparable to what we know about DNA and how those things are supposed to stay the same, the fundamental things that we have here. So Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 2 and Article 3 cover those three branches that we've been talking about of the government. So Article 1 covers the legislative branch, the House and Senate, the House of Representatives and our Senate. And Article 2 covers the president, the executive branch. And Article 3 is going to cover our judiciary, and then the Bill of Rights that the judiciary branch enforces. So, built in here are some checks and balances. And the framers of our Constitution, I think, were at a point when they could look back at history and see what worked and maybe think forward and what is a better system. And checks and balances were a fundamental concept that are built into the Constitution. So just in the first three articles, you see that the legislative branch is first. And even within that branch, there's some checks and balances because we've got the House and we've got the Senate, and the House follows a model of population. So the more people that are in a state, the more representatives they get. But with just as much power, the bicameral system allows for the Senate to have 2 representatives from every state, no matter what the population is. So when they were negotiating the Constitution, like a contract, you had 13 parties involved, and the smaller states or states with less people wanted to have a legislative branch that could speak for them, and they wouldn't be crippled by not having a lot of people. So that compromise involved having both the House of Representatives and the Senate in the way they're made up. Then there's checks and balances between the branches. So, the legislative branch makes the laws, they write the laws and enact them. The president either signs off on them, vetoes, and then a larger portion of the House and Senate would be necessary, 2/3 instead of half, to override the presidential veto. And then, of course, the court system in Article 3 interprets the laws or can even rule them unconstitutional. Now, the rest of the articles aren't incredibly important for this course, but I want to go through them because if we're going to cover the Constitution, we should talk about them. So Article 4 talks about how states are formed. It also gives full faith and credit. So here's where we talk about federalism and the play between states' authority and the federal government's authority. That's defined in Chapter 4. And then Chapter 5 talks about how to change the Constitution, to amend it, which is incredibly difficult to do. And, there's been few and far in between amendments to the Constitution. But basically, it takes 2/3 of a vote of both houses. Then it goes to the states for ratification, and you need 3/4 of the states to approve a ratification. So that's why it's hard to do. I mean, it's hard to pass a little law about a school bus having to stop at railroad tracks, for example, as we saw in Schoolhouse Rock. So if you can imagine changing the Constitution, especially if it's a controversial subject, it's very difficult to get that done. Then Article 6 is how to basically adopt prior US treaties, that there's an oath required for politicians. And Article 7 talks about the ratification process of the Constitution itself. And it's interesting, learning about the Constitution. I don't remember learning this, but in this course, I learned in the textbook that the United States Constitution is the oldest operating constitution. So we can take pride that, in a way, we're very much a leader in the history and development of constitutions and development of governments. But even more mind-blowing is that New York State actually was not one of the states to ratify the Constitution when it became binding on us. So 9 of 13 colonies had to ratify the Constitution for it to be binding on all of them. And actually 9 of them ratified it before we did. We were the 11th, and and there were a series of votes, and we eventually ratified it. And there was, this negotiating that I was talking about. If you compare the Constitution to a contract, the meeting of the minds between the states, actually New York was an outlier. So that's an interesting part of our history as a New York State citizen. But we ended up being in agreement, and we have a good history of cooperating with the federal government. But I do want to start talking about the controversies that happened right away. And the most interesting case early on in the government, which sort of gave value to and gave understanding to how the checks and balances work is spelled out in Marbury versus Madison. So you had our government early on, within the first 15, 20 years of operating, and we had a big challenge with Marbury versus Madison. So I'm gonna give you a video now about that, which I think does a better job of describing the case and the implications than I do. And in the meantime, I'm gonna get a little haircut and trim my beard, and we'll be back.